Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
Yeah.
You know how this works? We take your sources and really get into it. Today we're going to be looking at gender roles and the women's movement in India. I have to say, getting into this material is fascinating, but also um, made me realize there's a lot I just sort of took for granted.
Yeah, I think it is one of those topics where a lot of us have these kind of ingrained societal norms that we maybe don't even always realize are there. And
Yeah.
this deep dive is really going to kind of unpack those and how they impact everything from career choices to education to even how people go about trying to change things.
Yeah, and that's what I thought was so interesting right off the bat was how much these gender stereotypes impact what people think they can even do for a living.
Hmm.
There's an example of like a classroom exercise where they had students draw pictures of different professions. Like what comes to mind when you think of a nurse or a farmer or a scientist? I mean, it's
Yeah, it's so interesting because it's like you say that and like instantly people have an image in their mind. And, when they did this in the classroom, it was the same thing. It's most of the students, they drew nurses as women and then farmers and scientists and engineers as men. It's
yeah.
like they already have these ideas about what men do and what women do. And we're talking about kids here.
Yeah, and that's what's kind of scary, right? It's like
Yeah.
how early on do we start to internalize these stereotypes about, what's appropriate work for men and women? It's like we're limiting opportunities before people even have a chance to really explore what they're interested in.
Exactly. And then, you see these incredible stories of people who completely like break the mold. Like the material talks about Lakra, India's first female train engineer.
Oh, yeah. Lakshmi's story is so inspiring. You think about like a train engineer, it's not something you automatically picture a woman doing.
Mm.
And she went for it. She loved electronics and she pursued her passion and ended up like blazing a trail in a field dominated by men. And she has this quote that really stood out to me. She's like, as long as I'm having fun without harming anyone, as long as I'm doing well and helping my parents, why should I not lead a lifestyle of my choice? It's like,
Yeah, it's like such a simple statement, but it just cuts right to the heart of it.
Mhm.
It's like, why should these societal norms dictate how we live our lives? Laxmi's story shows that we have the power to choose our own paths, even if they defy
I
expectations.
mean, her success is like a beacon of hope, right? It's like you can break free from those stereotypes and achieve whatever you set your mind to. But it makes you wonder how many people are out there who have these dreams but are being held back by, you know,
By these invisible barriers that society has kind of erected. And I think it's something that we all need to think about, like, have you ever felt pressure to conform to certain expectations because of your gender? It's like we've all probably experienced it in some way.
absolutely, I know I have. Yeah. And it's eye-opening when you start to recognize those moments.
Yeah, for sure. It's like being aware of those pressures, both the external ones from society and even the internal ones we put on ourselves. That's the first step to breaking free.
So we've talked about like career choices,
Mhm.
but I was also really struck by the whole education piece. I mean, it's hard to believe that access to education was once restricted for girls in India. It seems so basic,
Yeah.
you know?
It's hard to imagine, right? Like education being denied to an entire group of people simply because of their gender. But that was the reality for a long time. It was a way to control women, keep them out of positions of power, and maintain the existing hierarchy.
And yet, even with those restrictions, there were these incredible women who fought for their right to learn, like Rushandari Devi, who secretly taught herself to read and write.
Yeah, her story is incredible. She risked everything because she believed in the power of knowledge.
Hmm.
And then you have, okay, Sakawat Hossein, who envisioned a future where women were flying planes and cars. I mean, talk about a visionary. She was writing the stuff at a time when girls weren't even allowed to attend school.
It's amazing how these women paved the way for future generations.
Yeah.
It's like they challenged not only the limitations placed upon them, but the very idea of what women were capable of.
And their stories highlight something really important about education. It's not just about, acquiring skills, it's about empowerment. It gives women the tools to question the status quo, to advocate for change.
It's like it gives you a different lens to view the world and to see your place in it. It makes you think about how education has shaped your own life, your own opportunities. I know I wouldn't be here without it.
Right. It's so fundamental to who we are and what we can achieve. And by providing women with access to education, it's like you're unlocking their potential. And it creates this ripple effect that transforms families, communities, the whole nation.
It's a powerful tool for social progress.
Okay.
So we've talked about stereotypes and education and how they kind of intertwine. But let's talk about the women's movement itself, because that's where you see this collective effort to really challenge these norms and fight for equality.
Yeah, and this is where things get really interesting. The women's movement in India is incredibly diverse. You have all these different groups, individuals with different perspectives and approaches. It's not like a monolithic entity. It's more like a tapestry of people working towards a common goal, but using all these different strategies to get there.
So what are some of those strategies? What are the different ways they've gone about tackling these issues?
Well, one of the key strategies is campaigning, organized efforts to sway public opinion or influence policy. For example, they campaigned relentlessly against dowry deaths, which were tragically common at one point. And eventually that led to changes in the law, providing women with more legal protection.
It's like their persistence paid off. It
Yeah.
shows that you can't ignore these issues when people come together and demand justice.
Exactly. And beyond the legal stuff, they've also been really effective at raising awareness, using everything from street plays and songs to public meetings and demonstrations. They've managed to bring these crucial issues to the forefront of public discourse.
And sometimes that public discourse needs a little extra push, right? Like when protests happen, it's like you can't ignore it anymore.
For sure. Protests are a powerful way to amplify marginalized voices and disrupt the status quo. They force people to pay attention to issues they might otherwise overlook.
And it's not just about making noise. It's about solidarity too, right? Like the material mentions the annual gathering at Wagah on the border of India and Pakistan, where women from both countries come together. It's like this beautiful image of transcending political divides in the pursuit of a common goal.
It's incredibly inspiring. It shows that our common humanity can bridge even the deepest divides. And then you have International Women's Day, this global celebration of women's achievements. It's a day to reflect on how far we've come, but also acknowledge how much work is still left to be done.
It's like a reminder that the fight for equality is an ongoing process. It requires constant effort and vigilance.
Yeah, exactly. So we've talked about campaigning, raising awareness, protesting, demonstrating solidarity. But I think it's important to define what we mean by women's movement because it's not this rigid, singular entity.
So how would you define it then?
Well, it's more of an umbrella term, right? It encompasses all these different groups and individuals who are working towards gender equality. So that means challenging patriarchy, advocating for equal rights and opportunities, and fighting against discrimination and violence. It's about dismantling the structures that limit women's choices and potential and creating a world where they can truly thrive.
So it's not just about achieving legal equality. It's about changing attitudes and creating a cultural shift where women are seen as equal partners in every aspect of life.
Exactly. It's about creating a world where gender is no longer a barrier, but rather a celebration of diversity and human potential.
That's a powerful vision. And it makes me think about the milestones achieved so far. What are some of the key victories of the women's movement in India?
Well, one of the earliest and most impactful was the Hindu Code bills passed in the 1950s. It granted women greater rights in areas like marriage, inheritance, and adoption, challenging centuries-old traditions and paving the way for future reforms.
Wow, so it shows that even those deeply ingrained traditions can be challenged and changed.
And it didn't stop there. In the 70s and 80s, there was a surge of activism around dowry deaths, domestic violence, and rape. This led to new laws criminalizing dowry harassment and domestic violence, and amendments to rape laws to better protect survivors.
So they took that awareness and translated it into concrete legal changes, providing women with much-needed protection.
Exactly. And those legal changes, in turn, helped shift societal attitudes. Like criminalizing domestic violence raised awareness and made it harder for perpetrators to get away with it.
It's like a cyclical process, right? Legal reforms lead to social change, which leads to more demands for equality.
Yeah, it's this constant push and pull, a continuous effort to break down barriers and create a more just society.
This has been an incredible deep dive so far. We've covered so much ground, from stereotypes in education to the strategies of the movement. But before we move on to the next concept, I want to give you, our listener, a moment to reflect. What stood out to you most in this first part? What questions or thoughts came up for you? Take a moment to think about it before we continue our exploration.
Yeah, take your time. We'll be right here, ready to dive into the next fascinating layer of this topic, so ready to jump back in.
Yeah, I'm ready to keep going. You know, we were talking about education earlier, and I feel like we could spend a whole deep dive just on that.
For sure. It's such a fundamental piece of this whole puzzle, Like, without education, it's hard to see how any real progress can be made.
Yeah, and it's crazy to think that it wasn't that long ago when girls in India were routinely denied access to education. Like the material mentioned some statistics from the 1961 census that were just mind-blowing.
Oh, yeah, those numbers were pretty stark. Only like 15% of women and girls were literate compared to 40% of men and boys. It's like they were intentionally trying to hold women back.
It's like they knew that if women were educated, the whole power dynamic would shift.
Exactly. Education gives you knowledge, critical thinking skills, the ability to question the status quo. It's a threat to any system built on inequality.
And yet, despite those obstacles, there were these amazing women who fought for their right to learn. We talked about Rashundari Devi and Ruqayya Sakhawat Hossain earlier, but their legacy lives on,
Oh, absolutely. They were pioneers. And you can see their impact in the progress that's been made in girls' education since then. Like in the 2011 census, the literacy rate for women had jumped to 65%.
Wow, that's a huge increase. Still a gap though, right?
Yeah, there's still a gap, but the progress is undeniable. And it's not just about the numbers. It's about what that education means for those women, their families, their communities.
Right, it's like a ripple effect. When you educate a girl, you're not just educating an individual, you're empowering a whole generation.
Exactly. They're more likely to challenge those traditional gender roles, to pursue careers in fields that were once off limits, to contribute to the economy and the development of their communities.
And they can make informed decisions about their own lives, their health, their families.
It's about giving them agency and control over their own destinies.
But the material also points out that it's not all sunshine and rainbows. There are still significant challenges, especially for girls from marginalized communities, like Dalit, Adivasi, and Muslim girls.
Yeah, unfortunately, those inequalities run deep. Poverty, discrimination, lack of infrastructure, all these things create huge barriers for girls trying to get an education.
So it's like they're facing a double whammy. They have to overcome obstacles at home, and then they face discrimination within the education system itself.
Exactly. It's like a system designed to keep them down.
So what are some of the specific challenges these girls face, and how can they be addressed?
Well, poverty is a big one. Many families simply can't afford to send their daughters to school, especially if they rely on their labor for income.
And there's still this idea that girls are a financial burden, right?
Mm.
Especially in cultures where dowry is still practiced.
Yeah, that's a huge factor.
Right.
It's like investing in a daughter's education is seen as a waste because she'll eventually be married off and become part of another family.
It's a messed up way of thinking, but it's the reality for a lot of people.
And then there's the discrimination they face within the education system itself.
Mm.
You know, prejudice from teachers and classmates, a lack of female role models.
So it's like they're constantly being told that they don't belong.
And to make matters worse, there's often a lack of infrastructure, especially in rural areas. Schools might be far away or lack proper facilities or have a shortage of qualified teachers.
It's like a perfect storm of obstacles. It
Right.
sounds overwhelming.
It is. It's a complex problem, but there are solutions. We need to invest in quality education, especially in underserved communities.
So building more schools, providing financial assistance to families, making sure there are enough teachers.
Exactly. It's about creating an environment where girls can thrive.
And it sounds expensive.
It is, but it's an investment worth making. Education is the key to breaking the cycle of poverty and empowering women to reach their full potential.
So it's not just a moral imperative, it's an economic one too.
Absolutely. And beyond investing in education, we also need to address the root causes of poverty and discrimination. That means tackling issues like caste-based prejudice, gender-based violence, economic inequality.
It's like a whole societal shift is needed.
It is, but it's possible, and we all have a role to play. By supporting organizations that work to empower girls, advocating for policy changes, challenging discriminatory attitudes within our own communities, we can make a difference.
So it's not just about the government or institutions, it's about individual action too.
Exactly. Every little bit helps. Every conversation we have, every choice we make can contribute to a more just and equitable world.
This deep dive into girls' education has been really eye-opening. It's clear that there's still so much work to be done, but it's also inspiring to see the progress that's been made.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that behind all the statistics and policy discussions are real people, real girls whose lives are being transformed by these efforts.
So before we move on to the next part of our deep dive, I want to give our listeners a moment to reflect. What resonated with you most about this conversation on girls' education? What questions or thoughts came up for you? Take some time to process this information, and we'll be back soon to delve into the next layer of this complex and fascinating topic. So we've talked about the challenges girls face in accessing education and the broader strategies of the women's movement. But what about the future? Like, what's next for the movement in India? Where do we go from here?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think it's important to acknowledge that the journey towards gender equality, it's a marathon, not a sprint. We've made some incredible strides, but there's still a long way to go.
So what are some of the roadblocks that are still out there? What are the biggest challenges that remain?
Well, one of the most pressing issues is the persistence of violence against women. We've got stricter laws now, and there's definitely more awareness, but the rates of domestic violence, sexual assault, honor killings, they're still alarmingly high.
It's like we're trying to change these deep-seated cultural norms, and that's not an easy thing to do.
Exactly. Laws can only go so far. You need a fundamental shift in attitudes, and that takes time and education.
So it's not just about punishing the perpetrators. It's about preventing the violence from happening in the first place.
Right. We need to challenge the patriarchal mindset that allows this violence to continue. We need to engage men and boys as allies, promote respectful relationships, create a culture where violence is simply unacceptable.
It's like a whole societal transformation is needed.
And that's not going to happen overnight, but it's something we need to keep working towards. And then on top of the violence, there's the economic disparity between men and women. Women still face discrimination in the workplace. They earn less. They're underrepresented in leadership positions.
It's like they're constantly hitting this glass ceiling.
And they often face barriers to accessing credit and financial resources. It's like the system is rigged against them.
So economic empowerment is key, right?
Yeah.
If women can't control their own finances, they can't truly be independent.
Absolutely. We need policies that promote equal pay, support women entrepreneurs, provide access to affordable childcare, all these things that allow women to fully participate in the economy.
And let's not forget about political representation. Women need to have a seat at the table where decisions are being made.
Right. They need to be involved in shaping the policies that impact their lives. We need more women running for office, more women in leadership positions.
So it's about changing the face of power.
And challenging the structures that keep women marginalized.
It's a lot to tackle.
It is, but it's not impossible. We've already come so far, and if we keep pushing, keep raising our voices, keep fighting for what's right, we can create a more just and equitable world for women in India and everywhere.
This deep dive has been incredible. I've learned so much and has given me a lot to think about.
Me too. It's been a real eye-opener. And I think that's the whole point of these deep dives, right? To challenge our assumptions, to make us think critically about the world around us.
Absolutely. So to all our listeners out there, I encourage you to keep learning, keep asking questions, keep the conversation going, because real change starts with each and every one of us. Thanks for joining us on this journey.